The city of Kiev has a long and glorious history. Throughout the ages, many figures have risen in defense of its people, but few loom quite as large as Queen Olga. Today, let us explore the history of this sainted shield of Kiev, who towered above the men of her era. I'll admit, I was not too familiar with the history of Eastern Europe heading into this episode, but as always, I've been able to turn to our sponsor Blinkist for a quick and easy way to ease into almost any subject. Blinkist is an app that puts the vast library of human history at your fingertips. What's more, it takes thousands of non-fiction books and uses experts to distill them down to their most essential ideas for you to easily digest with text or audio in just 15 minutes. It's been a great tool for me to explore a wide range of topics from the 27 selections offered by Blinkist. As a great example, I was recently able to listen to The Romanovs by Simon Montefiore, which covers the rise and fall of the dynasty which helmed the Russian Empire between the 17th to the 20th centuries. I followed that up with The Ukraine Crisis by Andrew Wilson, which covers the roots and implications of the modern conflict unfolding today. I'm sure that when you try Blinkist, you will also be able to explore many hidden gems of your own. Right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Click the link in my description to start your free 7-day trial with Blinkist and get 25% off a premium membership. Enjoy! In order to contextualize this story, I wanted to provide you with an overview of the region and time period we'll be focusing on. In a sentence, it is the land of the 10th century Kievan Rus, but there is much more to unpack here. We can begin by looking at geography. This area of Eastern Europe is bounded to the north by the Baltic Sea and to the south by the Black Sea. To the west lie the Carpathian Mountains, and to the far east lie the Urals. Within these natural borders extends the Great Sarmatic Plain, whose roughly 4 million square kilometers are filled with vast prairies and forests. Its relatively flat features are given character by several upland regions, as well as numerous river valleys and basins which gradually drain to the north or south. In terms of natural resources, it is rich with wild game, fish, timber, peat, copper, iron, silver, and more. Inhabiting these lands were a variety of people who lived largely nomadic lives. For instance, during antiquity, many of the inland regions were dominated by steppe tribes such as the Cimmerians, Scythians, and Sarmatians. In fact, so ancient was their way of life that it is believed that some of the first horses were domesticated in these lands. Neighboring the horse lords were others who lived more sedentary lives along the rivers and shores. Over the centuries, they would be mixed by migration, intermarriage, and conflict. From this union would arise various Proto-Slavic tribes, whom the ancient Greeks and Romans referred to as the Veneti and Spori. Unfortunately, little of their history is recorded, as they existed on the fringes of civilizations with written records. But they were by no means disconnected. The steppe tribes routinely raided beyond their homeland, while merchants shuffled goods back and forth across the vast waterways connecting far-flung regions. The Greeks even set up shop on the shores of the Black Sea, while the Achaemenids and later Romans launched military expeditions into the interior. Beyond this, there was certainly much more activity taking place, but we have neither the time nor the records to go over this in much detail at the moment. Fast forward several hundred years to the period of Great Migrations. It is during this era, stretching from the 4th to the 8th centuries AD, that the region experienced a more pronounced movement of people. The reasons are complex and poorly understood, but are generally traced back to pressures stemming from climate change, weather, crop yields, population increases, political instability, and invasion. Together, these resulted in waves and eddies that swirled the human landscape with great volatility. Among the first groups to spill into the so-called civilized world were the various Germanic tribes such as the Goths, the Vandals, the Anglo-Saxons, and countless others with overly prescriptive names which cover up the sheer variety of folks which existed under such labels. Behind them came others such as the Avars, the Bulgars, and the Slavs. It is this last group which largely came to rest in our area of interest. By the 7th century AD, their various tribes had split into multiple linguistic branches, and each regional group began to consolidate its own power within the context of their particular ecosystem. For the most part, the various population centers were quite spread out, with a common model of development involving walled cities being built atop defensive terrain from which the local elite and their followers could establish control over the surrounding regions. This influence could be further extended by tapping into major rivers through which men and goods could flow more readily. But they were not the only ones to recognize this. Many Northmen from the Baltic and Scandinavian regions made their way south across the great rivers to trade, raid, and seek fortune. These would slowly mix with the local Slavic and steppe tribes of the region. According to the 12th century records of the Primary Chronicle, the foreign Varangians were even invited to become overlords. Much academic debate surrounds this topic, and the issue is far from settled. However, what is clear is that either by conquest, diplomacy, or gradual integration, the two would merge around the 9th century AD to become the group we now refer to as the Rus. But again, we must remember that such labels are modern conveniences, which would have meant little to the people at the time. According to the Primary Chronicle, Rurik was the chieftain who founded the first ruling dynasty which led the Rus from Novgorod. Upon his death in 879, his successor Oleg would move the capital to Kiev, which he declared as the mother of Rus cities. It was ideally situated upon a series of hills overlooking the Dnieper. From here, its rulers could control the valuable trade routes which ran north to the Baltic Sea, south to the Black Sea, west to the Germanic lands, and east to the steppe. Riches in turn allowed its people to build fortifications and raise armies with which to even more quickly expand. However, given the great distances involved, control was only ever loosely established. The Kievan Rus territories were ultimately ruled by each of the local princes, which constantly jockeyed with one another and only united temporarily to fight common enemies such as the Pechenegs or the Byzantines. It is amidst this world of feuding great princes and warlords that Olga's story would unfold. Admittedly, little is known about her early life. Born sometime around the end of the 9th century, Olga was the daughter of a powerful regional lord. At a young age, she was married to Igor, whom the Primary Chronicle claims was the son of the legendary Rurik. However, during Rurik's passing, Igor was too young, and the chieftain Oleg was made regent of the realm. His reign was marked by continued outward expansion against other Slavic groups, such as the Drevlians, whom he brought to heel for a series of campaigns against the Byzantines, which reportedly reached as far as the gates of Constantinople. Eventually, Oleg would die around 912 AD, passing on the torch to Igor and his wife Olga. Igor was a Rus prince to his core. He was not particularly interested in the intricacies of the rule of law, and instead reigned as a hybrid Norse, Slavic, and Scythian warlord. Surrounded by his loyal družina, the bodyguard, retinue, and core of his army, he led regular raids against the surrounding powers. Such was the might of the Rus that they reportedly raised a force of around 1,000 ships and 40,000 men, which twice assaulted Constantinople. The city was only saved thanks to the use of its dragon-headed fireships. Yet this setback did little to quell the aspirations of Igor, who would never abandon his ambitions to be the first to sack the city of World's Desire. But such lofty goals required more money and men. It is for this reason that he now turned to the nearby Drevlians, who had stopped paying tribute to the Kievan Rus Prince since the death of his predecessor Oleg. In 945 AD, Igor would lead a force out against the Drevlian capital. Cowed by the size of the invading army, they immediately surrendered and paid tribute. However, the sum was found to be lacking, and Igor soon returned with a small escort of družina to collect the full tribute he felt he was owed. This double taxation was a step too far for the Drevlians. According to Byzantine sources, they captured the Kievans, murdered the retinue, and executed Igor by tying him to 2 bent birch trees, which, when released, tore his body in 2. This was a pointed message aimed at his now widowed wife Olga and her young 3-year-old son Sviatoslav. However, rather than drive fear into her heart, it only lit the deep fires of revenge. In the fallout of this disaster, Olga became regent on behalf of her son and reigned as the first woman to rule the Kievan Rus. In a land where might made right, many took this as a sign of weakness. The Drevlians in particular were emboldened by having just killed the strongest man in the area and now moved to assert their perceived right to dominance. As such, they sent emissaries to Kiev. These delivered not only the news of Igor's death, but also a marriage proposal. Prince Mal, chief of the Drevlians, would happily do Olga the favor of taking her and the grieving Sviatoslav under his arm, and, oh by the way, taking control of the entire region himself. But rather than weep at the loss or rage at the insult, Olga maintained an absolute calm. Behind this cool exterior, the gears quickly turned in her head. After a moment to reflect, she responded. The Primary Chronicle records the following, quote, "Your proposal is pleasing to me. Indeed, my husband cannot rise again from the dead, but I desire to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. Return now to your boat, and remain there with an aspect of arrogance. I shall send for you on the morrow, and you shall say, We will not ride on horses, nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat, and you shall be carried in your boat." The next day, the Drevlian emissaries returned and did as she said. To their delight, the people of Kiev rose to greet them, hoisting their boat aloft like some glorious throne, and carried them to the city center. Their smiles, though, quickly faded as the crowd parted to reveal a great pit that had been dug overnight. The boat now rode the human sea into the gaping maw. As the shocked Drevlians struggled to get their bearings, the people now began to throw dirt and stones upon them. As they were buried alive, Olga appeared at the rim of their grave. Ignoring their pleas for mercy, she laconically inquired whether they found the honor to their taste. But this was only the beginning of her revenge. With all traces of the emissaries literally buried, Olga then sent her own men back to the Drevlians. These delivered the message that she would be delighted to accept the proposal of Prince Mal. The Drevlians should therefore send a delegation of their great nobles to escort her to her future husband. Overjoyed, the chieftains were summoned and dispatched. When these arrived in Kiev, Olga greeted them in the court with full honors. As the perfect host, she attended to their every need with perfect graciousness, and even offered them the use of a specially prepared bathhouse where they could wash off the hardships of their journey. However, as the last of their number entered the great building, its doors were barred and locked. Olga now ordered her men to bring torches. Fires were set on all sides, and a pyre was made of the nobles. But Olga was not done yet. Now, she sent messengers to the Drevlians that she would not tarry with affairs at home, but instead come to them to mourn the passing of her late husband and to accept another. So she made the journey to their lands with only a small escort of the Druzhina. The Drevlians may have begun to worry about the lack of any news from their prior embassies, but the coming of Olga with such a small party put them at ease. After all, they had bested her husband Igor in a similar capacity. There was no reason to worry. What could one woman with such a small honor guard accomplish in the heart of Drevlian territory? There was only one small miscalculation with that thought. This woman was Olga. Once again, she stuck to the narrative that she was spinning and played the perfect role of the respectful widow who wept at the tomb of her late husband with all the rites of a traditional funeral. The Drevlians were convinced of her sincerity. Yet as the fires from the funeral feast began to die down, and as the men sank deeper and deeper into their cups, she gave a signal. All at once, on cue, her men drew their swords and began to hack at their inebriated hosts. According to the chronicles, she murdered 5,000 men that night, some of them personally. Now that subterfuge was no longer an option, Olga hurried back to Kiev. Here she raised the full strength of her army and returned to make open war on the Drevlians. Shocked and incapacitated as they were, they could do little to resist. Drevlian forces were driven back to their cities, with Olga marching on the survivors who huddled in the capital of Korostan. For nearly a year, she kept them pinned in with a siege, while subjugating the rest of the realm. As the war dragged on, she sent them a message. Quote, "Why do you persist in holding out? All your cities have surrendered to me and submitted to tribute, so that the inhabitants now cultivate their fields and their lands in peace. But you would rather die of hunger without submitting to my tribute?" Understandably, they showed hesitancy at her history of brutal vengeance, but were willing to entertain talks of submission. Ultimately, though, they were surprised to hear her respond with gracious terms. I'll let the chronicles tell the rest of the story. Quote, "Olga had need for neither honey nor furs, but had only one small request to make. 'Give me 3 pigeons,' she said, 'and 3 sparrows from each house. I do not desire to impose a heavy tribute like my husband, but I require only this small gift from you, for you are impoverished by the siege.' The Drevlians rejoiced and collected from each house 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows, which they sent to Olga with their greetings. Olga then instructed them, in view of their submission, to return to their city, promising that on the morrow she would depart and return to her capital. The Drevlians re-entered their city with gladness, and when they reported to the inhabitants, the people of the town rejoiced. Now, Olga gave to each soldier in her army a pigeon or a sparrow, and ordered them to attach a thread to each pigeon and sparrow, a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth. Olga then bade her soldiers to release the pigeons and the sparrows. so the birds flew to their nests, the pigeons to their cotes, and the sparrows under the eaves. Thus the dovecotes, the coops, the porches, and the haymounds were set on fire. There was not a house that was not consumed, and it was impossible to extinguish the flames, because all the houses caught fire at once. The people fled from the city, and Olga ordered her soldiers to catch them. Thus, she took the city and burned it, and captured the elders of the city. Some of the other captives she killed, while she gave others as slaves to her followers. The remnant she left to pay tribute. Finally, with this master stroke, Olga's vengeance was sated. But her reign was not solely defined by this bloodlust. Olga, like any other ruler of the Kievan Rus, could be brutal when the need arose. Yet unlike most of the other rulers, she committed herself to adding foundational rules to the system, fundamentally changing what had previously been a warlord state. For instance, she quickly set about stabilizing the realm Igor had left behind. While her son grew up, she established a vast series of outposts across her kingdom. These administrative centers were known as the Pogosti and were central to projecting the reign of Kiev. They functioned as hunting lodges, as milestones, as trading posts, and as taxation centers. The tribute system itself was also completely reorganized, becoming far more similar to a regular tax that communities would pay. Perhaps a lesson learned from the death of her late husband. Shortly thereafter, the Pogosti proved to be a crucial element for ruling the state, since they provided an enormous source of income, were an invaluable resource for merchant convoys, and provided a network of information for the rulers of Kiev. During this time of change, the merchant convoys were perhaps one of the most influential of all of these, and within a few years, writings from Constantinople tell of the annual caravans that gathered in Kiev and journeyed down the network of Pogosti between the lands of the Rus and the Byzantine Empire. Diplomatic channels were also opened between the two states, where previously there had mostly been war. These new inroads brought cultural exchange, and that cultural exchange, especially with the Byzantines' involvement, brought Christianity. While at first it was a point of friction, met by hostility, a more tolerant approach had its value. As with many other rulers dealing with Christendom, there were practical benefits of adopting a new religion. For Olga in particular, this was an opportunity to strengthen her ties to the Byzantine Empire, which was among the wealthiest and most powerful states of the era. Thus, she made the calculated decision to become the first ruler of the Rus to convert to Christianity. By doing so, she hoped to benefit economically, militarily, and geopolitically. By choosing this path, she would change the historical trajectory of her people and lay the groundwork for the eventual rise of the Eastern Orthodox Church in the region. The story of how this took place is a legendary one, which gets conveyed in many different forms by our sources. Historians disagree when and where she converted, but all agree that the process involved her traveling to Constantinople in person. By some accounts, the Byzantine emperor was said to be immediately taken with her beauty and her intellect upon her arrival, and quickly proposed that she remain in Constantinople with him. This soon escalated into talks of a marriage alliance, which would bring the lands of Kiev under the sway of Constantinople. Such an arrangement would have been a huge deal at the time, but Olga was wary that it would not be to her advantage, and thus sought to find a way to decline the offer without undermining the relationship in the process. Another clever ploy was prepared. According to one source, Olga now told the emperor that she would listen to his proposal, but only on one condition, that she first be baptized. She was careful to mention that she had been moved by the Christian religion, which the patriarch had been teaching her, and now understood that a Christian such as himself could not marry a pagan woman such as herself. Therefore, she would first need to be baptized. And of course, as a fellow ruler, she would only accept baptism at the hands of the emperor himself. The emperor, delighted by the flattery, agreed. What happened next is written in the Chronicle of the Rus. Quote, "After her baptism, the emperor summoned Olga and made known to her that he wished her to become his wife. But she replied, 'How can you marry me, after yourself baptizing me and calling me your daughter? For among Christians that is unlawful, as you yourself must know.' Then the emperor said, 'Olga, you have outwitted me.' He gave her many gifts of gold, silver, silks, and various vases, and dismissed her, still calling her his daughter." Once again, the clever queen had pulled off another masterclass of political maneuver. Yet in the process, it seems that her use of Christianity was not entirely a ploy. The Primary Chronicle recounts how she would go on to build churches in several Rus cities and championed efforts to bring about a greater degree of openness to the new religion. Apparently, she went as far as to try and convince her son to convert. While he resisted, the future ruler would nonetheless pledge to ease back on persecutions. This was perhaps an easy enough concession to make for a son who was increasingly preoccupied with leading armies rather than taking care of domestic issues. Such an arrangement worked well for the administrative genius of Olga, who could remain in Kiev to ensure things ran smoothly, while the prince played warlord. The years between 956 and 967 are indicative of this dynamic at play, with the Primary Chronicle reporting that Sviatoslav was leading ever more far-flung Rus campaigns while his mother remained at home. On one occasion, he was off fighting the Bulgarian Empire at the behest of the Byzantines, who had paid him handsomely to fight their enemies. Yet at the same time, the Byzantines also paid the Pechenegs to simultaneously attack him in the back. This was a classic move by the Greek power, which knew well how much cheaper it was to pit one's foes against one another with coins than to actually place boots on the ground. This particular ploy was extremely dastardly, as it resulted in the Pechenegs launching an attack directly on the vulnerable capital of Kiev. Yet again, Olga would serve as the shield to her people in their greatest time of need. On hand for the defense of the city, she had but a few units of družina from one of Sviatoslav's generals. However, these were on the wrong side of the river, with the encamped Pechenegs beginning to surround and lay siege to the city. For weeks, Olga led the defenses of the city and ensured that it stood resolute. Messengers were sent to ask for the immediate recall of her son and nearby forces, but it seems that the Pechenegs kept a tight blockade on communications. Without coordination, the družina were wary of carrying out an unsupported crossing of the river where they could easily be cut down. They were therefore left to watch idly as their city began to starve. When food inside Kiev had almost run out, Olga was finally able to find a young boy among her ranks who spoke the Pecheneg language. Briefed for a mission, he was then sent to infiltrate the enemy camp to bring word to the družina. Alarms were raised only as he made the crossing of the Dnieper, but it was already too late to stop him. The messenger informed the družina of Olga's plan. Though hesitant, the commander put his trust in the queen and committed to doing his duty. The next day, his men rode out for the river. They sounded every military instrument in their possession and made every attempt to inflate the appearance of their numbers. Right on cue, Olga now led a sally out from the city, with both forces making a rapid advance on the Pecheneg lines. The invaders, believing the main army had arrived, ordered an immediate retreat and opened diplomatic talks. The ruse was quickly revealed, but according to our sources, the Pecheneg general was so impressed by the trick that he chose to withdraw at this show of bravery and audacity. In this way, he hoped to cut his losses for now. However, Olga was not one to forgive and forget. She immediately sent a letter to her son, chiding him for abandoning his family to such a danger. This prompted his immediate return. The Kievans now chased back the invaders, crushing the Pechenegs on their own turf. This was to be the last glorious adventure of Olga. The great queen was around 70 years old and soon became bedridden with illness. Sviatoslav stayed at her side for 3 days until her final passing. Her son, grandsons, and all the people were said to weep at her death. In honor of her wishes, she would be buried according to Christian tradition. She left behind the foundations of a strong Kievan Rus state, which would prosper for centuries to come, and was the seed which brought Christianity to the realm. Here is how the Primary Chronicle puts it. Quote, Olga was the precursor of the Christian land, even as the day spring precedes the sun, and as the dawn precedes the day. For she shone like moon by night, and she was radiant among the infidels like a pearl in the mire, since the people were soiled and not yet purified of their sin by holy baptism. But she herself was cleansed by sacred purification. She was the first from Rus to enter the kingdom of God, and the sons of Rus thus praise her as their leader. For since her death, she has interceded with God in their behalf. Within 50 years of her death, Orthodox Christianity would take hold across the Kievan Rus lands, as her grandson Volodymyr the Great pledged himself to the faith. Olga herself would go down as a great figure who would be recognized as a saint to the church. To this day, she is revered as the patron of widows and keeps her vigil over the city of Kiev in its times of greatest need. A big thanks to the patrons for funding the channel, and to the researchers, writers, and artists who made this episode possible. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.